The door to the Northview group home for girls closed at exactly 9 in the morning on my 18th birthday. Not a slam, not even a loud click. Just the soft, bureaucratic sound of a well-oiled lock sliding into place behind me, severing the last thread that had connected me to 12 years of beige walls and scheduled meals, and the low hum of institutional fluorescence that never quite let you forget you were living on borrowed time in borrowed rooms. I stood on the concrete steps with everything I owned in a canvas duffel bag that smelled like mildew and cheap detergent. 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read so many times the spine had cracked clean through, a toothbrush, and $73 in crumpled bills I'd saved from the part-time dishwashing job they'd let me keep my senior year. The October air bit at my face, sharp and clean after years of breathing recycled air that always tasted faintly of disinfectant and someone else's shampoo. Freedom, they called it. The caseworkers who'd processed my release paperwork had smiled tired smiles and wished me luck with that particular blend of sympathy and relief people show when a problem is no longer theirs to solve. I was free. Free to walk into a world I understood only through smudged windows and supervised field trips. Free to figure out how to eat and sleep and exist, when the system that had raised me like a plant in a greenhouse had finally pushed me out the door into weather I'd never learned to navigate. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. I walked with my head down, the duffel digging into my shoulder, passing storefronts that were just opening for the day. A coffee shop, a dry cleaner, a pharmacy with advertisements for flu shots taped to the window. Normal people doing normal things. I felt like a ghost drifting through their world, invisible and insubstantial. My appointment was at 11. Mr. Davies, the county-appointed trustee, had called the group home 2 days ago to inform me of a meeting regarding my legal status as an adult. Standard procedure, the director had said. Nothing to worry about. Just paperwork to sign acknowledging that the state's obligation to me had officially ended. The office building downtown was tall and made of glass that reflected the gray October sky back at itself. I took the elevator to the 14th floor, my stomach churning. The receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name. She gestured toward a row of chairs upholstered in fabric the color of old bruises. I waited 20 minutes. Long enough to read every inspirational poster on the walls twice. Long enough to count the ceiling tiles. Long enough to wonder if I could just leave and pretend this meeting had never happened. That I could somehow slip through the cracks and disappear into a life where no one expected anything from me because no one knew I existed. The door to the inner office opened. Mr. Davies was exactly what I'd expected. A man in his late 50s with graying hair and a tweed jacket that had seen better decades. His face was kind in a weary way, like someone who'd spent too many years delivering news that ranged from disappointing to devastating, and had learned to keep his expressions neutral as a survival mechanism. He didn't waste time with small talk. We sat across from each other at a mahogany desk that was far too large for the small office, and he slid a cardboard box toward me. Simple, unassuming, held together with yellowing packing tape that looked like it had been there for years. The words came out quiet, almost apologetic. Wren, happy birthday. This is it. This is what was left in trust for you by your grandmother, Nora Whitmore. I stared at the box. My grandmother. The word felt foreign in my mouth, abstract as a mathematical concept I'd never quite grasped. I had no memory of her. No photograph tucked away in a drawer, nothing. The file they'd given me when I was old enough to ask questions had been thin as tissue paper. Mother deceased in automobile accident, age 6 months. Father unknown. Maternal grandmother deemed unfit for guardianship due to advanced age and financial instability. Ward of the state. No one had ever mentioned she'd left me anything. No one had ever suggested there was anyone out there who'd thought about me at all. Mr. Davies folded his hands on the desk, and I could see the effort it took to keep his voice steady, professional. Financially, there's nothing. I need you to understand that clearly. Your grandmother spent what little she had on legal fees trying to gain custody of you when you were an infant. When that failed, she spent the rest on maintaining a piece of property she owned in Montana. The state stipend you've been receiving ends today. What's in this box is your entire inheritance. He paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been genuine concern. And your only option, as far as I can see. My hands were shaking as I broke the old tape and lifted the flaps. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings I didn't look at too closely, were 3 items. A heavy iron key that looked like it belonged to a barn or a shed. A thick manila envelope that felt substantial in a way that made my chest tight. And a smaller, sealed envelope with my name written on it in faint, spidery handwriting that wavered across the paper like the writer's hand had been unsteady. That was it. No sentimental trinkets, no hidden cash. Just a key and 2 envelopes. The disappointment was a physical thing, sharp enough that I had to look away from Mr. Davies to keep him from seeing whatever expression had crossed my face. This was my inheritance. My grand legacy, the sum total of what one human life had managed to leave behind for another. Mr. Davies opened the larger envelope and spread the contents across his desk with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Property deed, tax assessments, legal documents with seals and signatures that meant nothing to me. His explanation was careful, measured. The deed is for 5 acres of land located in the Cascade Foothills region of Montana, approximately 3 hours east of here by bus. It was your grandmother's property. She purchased it 40 years ago with her late husband. He slid another paper toward me, and the number on it made my stomach drop. The property taxes are delinquent. 2 years past due, to be exact. You have 90 days to pay the outstanding balance of $8,700, or the county will seize the land and sell it at auction. $8,700. I might as well have owed $8 million. The number was so far outside the realm of my reality that it didn't even register as a real debt. It was just symbols on paper, meaningless as hieroglyphic. The key sat heavy in my palm when I picked it up, the metal cold and solid. And this? For the first time, something that might have been sympathy softened Mr. Davies's professional mask. According to the records, there's a single structure on the property, a Quonset hut. That key should open it. A Quonset hut. I'd seen pictures in history books. Metal half-cylinders used as temporary storage during wars, the kind of building that was never meant to be permanent, never meant to be a home. The system had raised me in institutions, trained me to expect disappointment, and somehow this still managed to feel like a cruel joke. I'd inherited a metal shed on a piece of land I was about to lose because I couldn't pay a debt that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Mr. Davies leaned forward, and I could tell he'd reached the part of this conversation he'd been building toward. There's one more thing, Ren. A development company called Vidian Development has been attempting to acquire land in that region for several years. They're planning a luxury resort, and they've made a standing offer for your grandmother's parcel. He placed a business card on the desk between us, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that screamed money. They're willing to pay $175,000. It's well above market value for raw land in that area. With that money, you could get an apartment, a reliable car, pay for community college if that's something you wanted. A real start. His gaze held mine, and I saw the calculation there, the equation he'd already solved in his head. It's the smart choice, Ren. The only realistic choice. There's nothing for you out there on that land. Your grandmother held on to it out of sentiment, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. I looked down at the items spread across the desk. The key, the deed, the business card with its promise of money I couldn't even imagine having, and the small envelope with my name on it, still sealed, still holding whatever words a dead woman had thought important enough to preserve for a granddaughter she'd never been allowed to meet. Something in me recoiled from the idea of opening it there, in that sterile office, with Mr. Davies watching. Whatever was inside felt too private, too raw for fluorescent lights and professional sympathy. I heard myself say the words before I'd fully formed the thought. I want to see it first. The land. Before I decide. Mr. Davies' eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his composure. Ren, I don't think you understand. The tax deadline is in 90 days. The property is 3 hours away by bus, and there's no housing nearby. The Quonset hut is just a storage shed. It was never meant to be habitable. But I was already gathering the items back into the box, the key going into my pocket where I could feel its weight, solid and real. I still want to see it. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw him decide it wasn't worth the argument. People who'd aged out of the system made poor decisions all the time. Let them learn the hard way. Let them come back in a few weeks, desperate and humbled, ready to take the money and be grateful for it. He slid a final paper across the desk. This is the contact information for Vidian's acquisition team. When you're ready to sell, call them. They'll handle everything. I left the building with the cardboard box under my arm and no destination in mind except away. The street outside was full of people rushing to lunch meetings and appointments, their lives organized around calendars and obligations that made sense to them. I stood on the corner and felt the enormity of my freedom crash over me like a wave. I could go anywhere, do anything. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The Greyhound station smelled like diesel fuel and old coffee. I bought a ticket to a town called Ridgeview in the Cascade Foothills region of Montana with 43 of my $73. The bus left in 2 hours. I spent the time in a corner seat, watching people come and go, and tried not to think about the envelope in my bag with my name on it, in handwriting I'd never seen before. The bus was half empty. I took a window seat near the back and pressed my forehead against the glass as the city fell away behind us. Concrete and steel gave way to sprawling suburbs, then farmland, and finally the deep, dense green of foothills that rose into mountains I could barely see through the low-hanging clouds. The world transformed, mile by mile, into something that felt like a different planet entirely. I'd never been outside the city. Every foster home, every group placement, every supervised outing had kept me within a radius I could have drawn on a map with a compass. This felt like crossing a border into territory that operated under different rules, different expectations. The other passengers were quiet, locals whose faces were weathered in ways that suggested they spent their lives outside, working with their hands, their conversations muted and practical. 3 hours. That's how long it took for the sky to gain texture and depth, for the air that seeped through the bus's ventilation to smell like pine instead of exhaust. 3 hours to travel from everything I'd known into a landscape that looked like it belonged in a painting, not in the real world I'd been taught to navigate. The bus dropped me at a pull-off on the side of a 2-lane highway. Not a station, not a building. Just a gravel turnout with a weathered sign that read, Ridgeview, 4 miles. The driver gave me a look that might have been concern or pity, and the hydraulic doors hissed shut behind me as the bus pulled away, leaving me standing alone on the shoulder with my duffel bag and the cardboard box, and nothing but forest in every direction. The silence was profound, total. broken only by wind moving through branches high above and the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. I'd lived my entire life surrounded by the constant white noise of civilization. Traffic, voices, machinery, the ambient hum of a city that never truly slept. This silence felt alive in a way that made my skin prickle with something between fear and wonder. The map Mr. Davies had given me showed a dirt road branching off the highway about half a mile ahead. I started walking, my sneakers crunching on gravel, the straps of my bag cutting into my shoulder. The trees here were massive, towering things that blocked most of the sky, their trunks thick enough that 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around them. The air was cold and clean and tasted like nothing I'd ever breathed before. The dirt road was easy to miss, just a gap in the trees with 2 tire ruts worn into the earth, overgrown with weeds that suggested not many people traveled it anymore. A rusted mailbox leaned at an angle near the entrance. The name Whitmore barely visible under layers of oxidation and weather damage. 4 miles, the bus driver had said when I'd asked. 4 miles down this road to the property line. I shifted the box to my other arm and started walking. The forest here felt primordial, old-growth pines that had probably been saplings when my grandmother was young. When this land was something people still carved out of wilderness, rather than inherited through probate. Fallen logs thick as my torso lay across the path in places, forcing me to climb over or around them. The silence was broken occasionally by rustling in the underbrush, small creatures I couldn't see moving through territory I was clearly trespassing on. My feet hurt by the time the trees finally opened up into a clearing. My shoulders ached from the weight of the bag and box. But I forgot all of that the moment I saw what I'd inherited. 5 acres of wild meadow stretched out before me, the grass tall enough to brush my waist in places, dotted with wildflowers that had gone to seed and blackberry brambles that formed impenetrable walls along the edges. And in the center of it all, like the skeleton of some ancient beast half buried in the earth, sat the Quonset hut. It was bigger than I'd expected. 40 feet long at least, its corrugated steel skin weathered to a deep mottled orange that glowed in the weak afternoon light filtering through the clouds. The metal had rusted in patterns that looked almost artistic, like someone had deliberately oxidized it to create texture. It didn't look like a building so much as a relic, something left behind by people who'd moved on to better places and never looked back. And there, parked beside it, as if waiting for someone to return, was a tractor. John Deere green faded to a pale ghost of what it must have been originally, one of those old models from the 50s with the simple, elegant lines that suggested function over form. The tires were flat, the metal surfaces spotted with rust, but it sat there with a dignity that made me stop and stare. Why would she leave it here? A tractor worth at least a few $1,000s, even in this condition, just sitting in an overgrown field when she'd barely had money to pay property taxes. The front of the Quonset hut had a simple steel door set into the curved wall. I pulled the key from my pocket, my hands shaking slightly as I fitted it into the lock. It stuck at first, the mechanism probably frozen from years of disuse. But I put my shoulder into it and felt something inside give way with a grinding crack that echoed inside the structure. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed in protest, and I stepped into darkness that smelled like rust and motor oil and time. Cold air rolled out, stale and thick, carrying the scent of a place that had been sealed tight for months or maybe years. Light filtered in through a few grimy plexiglass windows set high on the curved walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the beams like tiny galaxies. The interior was cavernous, one long open space with a concrete floor cracked and stained with oil and water damage. Against one wall stood a long workbench littered with old tools, hammers, wrenches, coffee cans filled with bolts and nails, everything covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. A cast-iron wood stove sat in one corner, its chimney pipe snaking up through the ceiling. In the far back, barely visible in the deep shadows, I could make out a simple wooden cot with a thin, stained mattress. Next to it, a footlocker made of old wood, its metal corners tarnished but intact. This was where my grandmother had lived. Not visited occasionally. Lived. The evidence was everywhere once I started looking. A chipped mug on the workbench. A wool blanket folded at the foot of the cot. A pair of work boots by the door that looked sized for a woman's feet. This metal shell in the middle of nowhere had been someone's home, someone's entire world. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, and the sound swallowed itself in the vast space. For the first time since leaving the group home that morning, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my situation. I was standing in a rusted shed on 5 acres of overgrown land, in a part of the country I'd never seen before, with $73 to my name and a tax bill I couldn't pay. Mr. Davies was right. The smart thing, the only rational choice, was to call Vidian Development and take their money. Use it to build something resembling a normal life in a city where I at least understood the rules. But I couldn't shake the feeling that coming here had been important, that seeing this place, standing in the space my grandmother had occupied, was something I'd needed to do before I could make any kind of decision about what came next. The footlocker drew me like a magnet. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting against the cold concrete, and found it wasn't locked. The hinges creaked when I lifted the lid, and the smell that rose from inside was different, dry and papery, with an undertone of something organic I couldn't quite place. Inside, arranged with careful precision, were the tools of a life I couldn't begin to understand. Hand tools wrapped in oiled cloth, their wooden handles worn smooth from use. Canvas bags that clinked when I lifted them, filled with seeds, potatoes, beans, squash, each bag labeled in the same spidery handwriting I'd seen on the envelope. And underneath everything, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, a stack of cash held together with a rubber band that crumbled to dust when I touched it. I counted it 3 times, certain I'd made a mistake. $6,200 in 20s and 50s, some of them so old they looked like museum pieces. Not a fortune, but exactly $2,000 more than the tax bill. Exactly enough to keep the land for another year, with a little left over. She'd planned this. Somehow, despite everything, she'd known I'd come here. Known I'd need this. The realization made my throat tight. At the bottom of the footlocker, beneath where the money had been, I found a folder containing hand-drawn blueprints. Technical drawings done in pencil on graph paper, showing the Quonset hut from multiple angles with measurements and notes scrawled in the margins. The heading at the top of the first page read, "Earth Shelter Conversion," in block letters, and underneath in smaller script. Cover exterior with 24 inches minimum soil. Plant deep-root grass. Structure will become invisible within 18 months. I spread the papers on the workbench, trying to make sense of the plan. She designed a way to bury the Quonset hut under earth and sod, to transform it from a visible metal structure into something that would blend with the landscape, become part of the hill. The notes explained the reasoning. Thermal insulation, protection from weather, reduced visibility, but also, in handwriting that looked shakier than the rest, "They cannot take what they cannot find." Who were they? Vidian Development? Someone else? I folded the blueprints carefully and set them aside. My grandmother had left me more than land and a tax bill. She'd left me a plan. A way to survive here if I was brave enough, or desperate enough, or stupid enough to try. The tractor waited outside, patient as a gravestone. I walked to it through grass that soaked my jeans to the knees, touched the cold metal of the hood, and felt something shift inside my chest. This machine was worth money. It could be sold, refurbished, put back to use. But she'd left it here for a reason. The seat was a simple metal pan, flat and uncomfortable looking. I climbed up and sat down, feeling ridiculous and profound all at once. And that's when I noticed the seam, a hairline crack around the edge of the seat that suggested it wasn't welded in place, but rather fitted. I ran my fingers along it, found the catch hidden underneath, and pressed. The seat lifted on hinges I hadn't known were there, revealing a compartment beneath. And inside that compartment, protected from weather and time by the simple barrier of metal, was a tin box. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The box was old, its painted surface scratched and dented, but the lid came off easily to reveal what was inside. Envelopes. Dozens of them. More than 100. All addressed to Wren Adelaide Callahan, Northview Group Home for Girls. All stamped with the same devastating words in red ink. Return to sender. I counted them with trembling fingers. 153 letters. But as I examined the dates on the postmarks, something didn't add up. The earliest letter in this tin box was dated 12 years ago, when I would have been 6 years old. But my file said I'd entered foster care at 6 months after my mother died. 12 years of letters meant she'd started writing when I was 6, not when I was 6 months old. That was 5.5 years unaccounted for. 5.5 years of silence that made no sense unless there had been other letters. Earlier ones. Letters from when I was a baby, when I first entered the system. Letters that had been lost or destroyed or simply never made it into this tin box. The foster care system was chaos. Files got misplaced. Belongings disappeared when you moved between homes. Paperwork vanished into bureaucratic black holes. These 153 letters weren't all she'd written. They were what had survived, what she'd managed to keep when everything else had been taken or lost. The realization made the loss feel even more profound. Not just 12 years of trying to reach me, but 18 years. From the moment I was taken from her arms as an infant until 3 months ago when she died. And all I had left were these fragments. The first envelope in the stack was yellowed with age, the paper brittle at the edges. I tore it open carefully, unfolded the single sheet inside, and began to read words written in the same shaky hand that had drawn the blueprints. Dearest Wren, today is your 6th birthday. I am writing this from my kitchen table, looking out at the land I have kept for you, and I am crying because I cannot be there to celebrate with you. The lawyers tell me I still cannot visit. They tell me the court's decision is final. I am 62 years old, too old to be a proper guardian, they say. Too unstable financially, too isolated geographically. All the reasons they used to take you from me when you were 6 months old, after your mother died in that terrible accident. I did not abandon you, my sweet girl. They took you from my arms when you were still so small, when you still smelled like milk and baby soap, and they told me it was for the best. That a young child needed more than an aging widow could provide. I have been writing to you since that day, every week for 6 years now. Most of my letters never reach you, returned by the system, lost in transfers between homes, destroyed by caseworkers who think cutting contact is easier than maintaining hope. These letters you're reading now, if you ever read them, are the ones I've managed to save. The proof I kept trying. But I want you to know there were so many more. Hundreds more in those early years that vanished into the system's machinery. You were never alone, Wren. Not for a single day. I am out here. I am keeping this land for you. This place where your mother grew up, where she learned to love the smell of pine and the way the light changes when clouds move across the mountains. One day you will be 18. One day the law will have to let you go. And when that happens, I will have this waiting for you. A home. A place that is yours by right and by blood. I love you, my darling girl. I have loved you every single day. Your grandmother, Nora. The paper crumpled in my hands as something inside me broke open. I'd spent 18 years believing I was unwanted. 18 years thinking that whoever my family had been, they'd looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. And all that time, every single week, this woman I'd never met had been writing letters to tell me I was loved. So many letters that most of them had been lost. Disappeared into a system that treated human connection as inconvenient paperwork. I sat on the tractor in the fading afternoon light and read letter after letter, my face wet with tears I didn't bother to wipe away. The handwriting got shakier as the years progressed, the paper occasionally spotted with what might have been water damage or tears. She wrote about the weather, about the deer that came to graze in the meadow, about repairs she'd made to the Quonset hut and plans she had for when I came home. Because that's what she called it, home. As if it had always been mine, as if she'd just been keeping it warm until I could claim it. The later letters grew more desperate, more urgent. She wrote about a company that had started buying up land in the area, about pressure from people she didn't name, about feeling watched and threatened. The legal language gave way to pleading. Please be careful when you come here, Wren. Please know that what I am doing, what I have done, is to protect you and to protect this place that is your birthright. The final letter in the stack was dated 3 months ago. The handwriting was barely legible, the words wandering across the page like someone had written them in the dark or with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Wren, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally come home. I am so sorry I could not be here to meet you. I am sorry for so many things, but most of all, I am sorry I could not protect you from what is coming. Vidian Development wants this land. They want the spring on the north boundary. It feeds 6 farms, and if they control it, they control the water for the entire region. They have been relentless. They have made offers I have refused. They have made threats I have ignored. But I am old now, Wren, and I am afraid. 2 nights ago, a man came to my door. He did not give his name. He said I had 1 week to accept their offer or face consequences. I told him this land belongs to my granddaughter and I will never sell. He smiled and told me, accidents happen to stubborn old women living alone. I am writing this because I need you to know. If something happens to me, it will not be an accident. And if something happens to you... The letter ended there, mid-sentence. The paper bore a dark stain along one edge that I desperately wanted to believe was coffee or dirt, but knew with sick certainty was blood. I sat very still on the tractor seat, the letters scattered around me like fallen leaves, and tried to process what I'd just learned. My grandmother hadn't died of old age or illness or any of the natural causes I'd assumed. She'd been threatened, and she died 3 months later under circumstances that had probably been ruled accidental, but that she'd known, had predicted, were anything but. The meadow around me felt different now. Not peaceful, but exposed. The tree line that had seemed picturesque now looked like it could hide anything. Anyone. The Quonset hut wasn't just a shed. It was a target. And I was standing right in the center of it with $73 in my pocket and no idea what I'd just inherited beyond land and debt and danger. The sun was getting low, painting the clearing in shades of amber and shadow. I gathered the letters carefully, reverently, and placed them back in the tin box. 153 letters from a grandmother I'd never met, telling me I was loved, telling me I belonged somewhere, warning me about threats I didn't understand. A fraction of the hundreds she'd actually written over 18 years, most lost to a system that cared more about procedure than connection. Mr. Davies had said selling was the smart choice, the only rational option. And maybe he was right. Maybe the intelligent thing to do was take Vidian's money, walk away from this place, and try to build a life somewhere safe and ordinary. But as I looked at the Quonset hut, my grandmother's home, the place she'd kept for me through years of silence and rejection and finally threats, I felt something harden in my chest. A resolve I didn't know I possessed. I'd spent 18 years being moved from place to place, living in rooms that belonged to other people, sleeping in beds that had held dozens of other forgotten children. I'd never had anything that was mine, never had anywhere I could point to and say, "This is where I come from." And now I did. 5 acres in the middle of Montana, a rusted metal shell that could be transformed into something hidden and safe. And 153 letters, the survivors of hundreds more, telling me I'd been wanted all along, that someone had fought for me even when the fight seemed hopeless. I climbed down from the tractor and walked back into the Quonset hut, my decision settling over me with the weight of something irreversible. The smart choice would have been to sell, but I'd never been particularly smart when it came to self-preservation, and I was tired of letting other people decide where I belonged. I would stay, at least long enough to understand what my grandmother had been protecting, long enough to decide if this land was worth fighting for, or if I was being a romantic fool, throwing away the only real chance I'd ever get. The footlocker held enough money for taxes and survival. The blueprints held a plan for disappearing. And somewhere out there, a company called Vidian Development was waiting for me to make the rational choice, the easy choice, the choice every reasonable person would make. I pulled the small envelope with my name on it from my bag, the one I hadn't opened in Mr. Davies' office. Whatever else my grandmother had wanted to tell me would be inside. I broke the seal and unfolded the single page, and her final words to me were simple, devastating, perfect. Welcome home, Wren. Fight for it. This is yours. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my pocket, right next to the iron key. Then I started a fire in the wood stove with kindling I found stacked against the wall, and I watched the flames catch and grow, warming the space that would be my home for however long this lasted. Outside, night was falling fast over the Cascade foothills. The temperature was dropping, and somewhere in the darkness, people who wanted this land were probably already planning their next move. But for tonight, I had walls and a roof and a fire. I had $6,200 and a plan drawn in my grandmother's careful hand. And I had 153 letters, precious survivors of so many more, telling me I belonged here. It would have to be enough. I woke to the sound of an engine I didn't recognize and sat bolt upright on the cot, my heart hammering against my ribs. The morning light through the grimy windows was pale and weak, barely illuminating the interior of the Quonset hut, and for a disorienting moment I couldn't remember where I was or why the walls curved overhead like the belly of some enormous animal. Then it came back in a rush. Montana. The letters. The inheritance I couldn't afford and couldn't abandon. The engine cut off outside. A door slammed. Footsteps crunched across gravel and dead grass, purposeful and unhurried. And I realized with a jolt of fear that I had no idea if the person approaching was friendly or if I'd just spent my first night on land that someone else wanted badly enough to kill for. I grabbed the iron key from where I'd set it on the workbench, the weight of it in my hand offering some pathetic illusion of protection, and moved to the door just as a knock echoed through the metal walls. The woman standing on my threshold was probably in her mid-60s, her hair silver white and cut short in a style that suggested practicality over vanity. Her face had the kind of weathered beauty that came from decades spent outdoors. Deep lines around her eyes that might have been from squinting into sun or smiling, though she wasn't smiling now. She wore work jeans and a canvas jacket and boots that had seen serious use, and she looked at me with an expression that mixed curiosity with something harder to read. Her voice came out rough, skeptical. "Who are you? And what are you doing on Nora Whitmore's property?" The directness caught me off guard. I'd been expecting threats or demands, not this blunt interrogation that felt more protective than hostile. My own voice sounded small in comparison. "I'm Wren Callahan. I'm her granddaughter." Something shifted in the woman's face, the hard edges softening into an expression that looked like grief mixed with wonder. She took a step closer, studying my features with an intensity that made me want to look away. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. "My God, you look just like her, like Nora when she was young." She extended a hand that was calloused and strong. "Ivy Brennan. I live 2 miles down the road. Your grandmother was my closest friend for 20 years. I shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip, and something in my chest loosened slightly. A friend. Someone who'd known my grandmother as more than words on paper or handwriting on envelopes. Ivy's eyes traveled past me to the interior of the Quonset hut, taking in the evidence of my makeshift camp. The duffel bag on the floor, the wood stove still radiating faint heat from last night's fire, the tin box of letters sitting on the workbench where I'd left it. Her voice dropped to something quieter, more careful. "When did Nora die?" The question hit me sideways. 3 months ago. At least, that's what the lawyer told me. I only found out 2 days ago when they released me from... I caught myself, not wanting to explain the group home, the system, all of it. When they told me about the inheritance, Ivy nodded slowly and I saw her doing the math, putting together pieces I didn't know were part of a larger puzzle. 3 months. That lines up. Before I could ask what she meant, she was moving past me into the Quonset hut, her movements comfortable and familiar in a way that suggested she'd been here before. She went straight to the wood stove, opened the front grate to check the remaining coals, and began adding kindling from the stack with practiced efficiency. Over her shoulder, casual as commenting on weather, "Nora talked about you constantly. Every time I saw her, she'd tell me about the letters she'd written that week. About how one day you'd be old enough to come home. She never stopped looking for you. Never stopped hoping the system would let her have some contact." The words landed like blows, each one opening up the wound I'd been trying not to examine too closely. 12 years of letters I'd found. 18 years total of a grandmother who'd wanted me while I'd been told I had no family who cared. Ivy straightened from the stove, and her expression had gone hard again. "But you need to understand something, Wren. Your grandmother didn't die in an accident. I don't care what the coroner's report says. Nora Whitmore was 79 years old and she could still split firewood and haul water from the spring without breaking a sweat. She didn't just fall and hit her head in her own home." My pulse kicked up, my grandmother's final letter burning in my memory. "What do you mean?" Ivy pulled out one of the stools from the workbench and sat, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that told me she was holding back strong emotion. "Vidian Development has been buying up land in this region for 5 years. They've got plans for some luxury resort, hiking trails, fishing lodges, The whole upscale wilderness experience package. But they need water rights to make it work. And the spring on the north end of your property feeds 8 farms, including mine. Whoever controls that spring controls the water for this entire area. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. Nora was the last holdout. 4 other families sold in the past 3 years. The Johnsons took the money and moved to Idaho. The Torres family held out until someone poisoned their well and their livestock started dying. The Hendersons had their barn burned down 3 times in one summer. All accidents, according to the county. All coincidentally happening to people who wouldn't sell to Vidian. The pattern was clear, even if the details were still murky. My grandmother had been standing between a development company and their expansion plans, and she'd paid for that resistance with her life. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The last letter she wrote me said someone came to her door, threatened her. She wrote that if something happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. Ivy's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. I believe it. 3 weeks before she died, Nora came to my place at midnight. She was scared, really scared, which wasn't like her. She said a man had been watching the property, that her gate lock had been tampered with, that she'd found boot prints near the spring that weren't hers. I told her to call the sheriff, but she said the sheriff's department was already in Vidian's pocket. Too much money flowing through too small a county. Everyone's got their price. The enormity of what I'd walked into was starting to crystallize. This wasn't just about inheriting land. It was about stepping into the middle of a fight that had already turned deadly, that had already claimed at least 1 life, and possibly more. Ivy stood, walked to the door, and looked out at the meadow where morning mist was burning off in the strengthening sunlight. So now you know. The question is what you're going to do about it. That lawyer of yours probably told you Vidian's willing to pay well above market value. Smart money says you take it and run. Don't make your grandmother's mistake. But there was something in her tone that suggested she didn't actually believe I'd take that advice. That maybe she was testing me to see what kind of person I was beneath the fear and uncertainty. I thought about the letters in the tin box. About 18 years of unwavering determination. Most of those letters lost, but the love behind them never diminishing. About a woman who'd kept this land, not because it made financial sense, but because it was supposed to be mine. Because she'd promised herself she'd have something to give me when I finally came home. The words came out before I'd fully formed the thought. I'm staying. Ivy turned back to face me, and for the first time I saw approval in her expression. Then you'd better be ready for a fight. Vidian doesn't take no for an answer, and they've got resources you can't match. Money, lawyers, people in positions of power who owe them favors. She moved to the workbench, picked up the folder of blueprints I'd left there, and studied the earth shelter plans with clear recognition. Nora showed me these about a year ago. She was planning to bury this place, make it invisible. Smart idea if you're trying to hide from people who want you gone. The plan made more sense now. Not just insulation and thermal efficiency, camouflage, protection. A way to live on land that someone else wanted without being an obvious target. Ivy set the blueprints down and met my eyes. You'll need help. This isn't a one-person job, and you'll need to move fast before Vidian figures out you're not selling. I know a few people in town who might be willing. Your grandmother did a lot of favors over the years, helped a lot of folks when they needed it. Some of them still remember. The offer of help was unexpected enough that I felt something loosen in my chest. The tight knot of isolation I'd been carrying since leaving Northview beginning to unravel. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Ivy's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. Nora was family to me. Not blood, but the kind that matters more. The kind you choose. That makes you family too. whether you know it yet or not. She pulled a scrap of paper from her jacket pocket and scribbled something on it with a pencil stub. This is my number. You need anything, tools, advice, someone to watch your back, you call. And tomorrow, drive that old truck into Ridgeview and pay those property taxes before Vidian finds a way to accelerate the timeline. Once the deed is clear, you'll have more legal standing. The truck. I'd forgotten about the ancient Ford that had been sitting beside the Quonset hut looking like a museum piece. The idea of driving it anywhere seemed impossible. Ivy read my expression, and her smile became more genuine. Keys are probably in the ignition. Nora kept it running. She was good with engines, better than most men I know. You'll figure it out. She left the way she'd arrived, her old pickup kicking up dust as it disappeared down the rutted road. And I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's home, feeling like I'd just been handed a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. The work started that afternoon. I spent 2 hours getting the Ford started, pumping the gas pedal and turning the key until the engine finally caught with a roar that sent birds scattering from the nearby trees. The truck smelled like oil and rust and old leather, and driving it felt like piloting a boat through rough water. But it moved. I made it to Ridgeview by late afternoon. The town was exactly what I'd expected. A main street with maybe 20 buildings, most of them looking like they'd been there since before I was born. A general store, a diner, a post office, a library that looked like it had maybe 1,000 books total, and the county office where I could pay the property taxes that stood between me and complete disaster. The clerk who processed my payment was a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain who looked at me with open curiosity when I counted out the cash. $8,700 in worn bills that I'd smoothed flat that morning, trying to make them look less like money that had been hidden in a footlocker for years. Her fingers moved efficiently across a keyboard that looked older than I was. "You're the Whitmore girl, the granddaughter." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in small towns, apparently. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more, and watched her print out a receipt that officially made me the legal owner of 5 acres I still wasn't entirely sure I wanted. She handed it across the counter with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your grandmother was a good woman, stubborn as they come, but good." Shame what happened. The way she said it suggested she knew exactly what had happened, that the official story of an accidental fall hadn't convinced anyone who'd actually known Nora Whitmore. I folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket. "Thank you." The library was 3 doors down, a small brick building with tall windows that let in afternoon light. I went in mostly because I didn't want to drive back to the property yet. Wasn't ready to face the isolation and the silence and the weight of decisions I still needed to make. The woman at the circulation desk looked up from a computer screen and smiled with genuine warmth. She was probably in her early 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a cardigan that looked hand-knitted and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Her voice was soft, welcoming. "Can I help you find something?" I hadn't come in with a plan, but suddenly I knew exactly what I needed. "Do you have old newspapers? Going back maybe 18 years? Her expression shifted to curiosity. "We have them on microfiche. What are you looking for?" The lie came easily, born from years of learning not to reveal too much to authority figures who might use the information against you. "Just researching local history. Family history." She led me to a back room with a microfiche reader that looked like it predated the internet, showed me how to load the film and navigate the dated interface, and left me alone with the archived ghosts of newspapers past. It took me 40 minutes to find what I was looking for. A short article from 18 years ago, buried on page 5 of the County Weekly. "Local woman dies in single car accident. My mother's name, Grace Whitmore Callahan. and a brief description of a vehicle that had gone off County Road 47 in icy conditions, rolled twice, and come to rest in a ravine where it had burned. The driver was pronounced dead at the scene, survived by her mother, Nora Whitmore, and infant daughter currently in state custody pending guardianship determination. The investigating officer's name was listed at the bottom, Deputy Martin Kessler. I loaded more recent microfiche and found my grandmother's death notice, equally brief. Longtime resident Nora Whitmore, 79, dies in home accident. A fall in her own living space, head trauma, discovered 2 days later by a concerned neighbor. No foul play suspected. Investigating officer, Sheriff Martin Kessler. The same man, 18 years apart, 2 accidents in the same family, both cleared by the same officer who'd somehow gone from deputy to sheriff in the intervening years. My hands were shaking as I rewound the microfiche. This was what my grandmother had meant in her final letter. This was the pattern she'd seen, the threat she'd tried to warn me about. The DN development didn't just make offers, they removed obstacles. And they had someone in law enforcement willing to sign off on whatever story made the deaths go away cleanly. The librarian, her name tag read Lillian Hayes when I found her again at the front desk, looked concerned when she saw my expression. Did you find what you needed? I wanted to tell her everything, about the letters and the threats and the impossible coincidence of 2 accidents investigated by the same officer. But paranoia kept my mouth shut. I didn't know who in this town could be trusted, whose mortgage might be paid by Vidian money, who might report back to Sterling Voss that the Whitmore girl was asking dangerous questions. Instead, I just nodded. Yes, thank you. She handed me a library card application with another of those warm smiles. If you're going to be around for a while, you should get a card. We don't have much, but you're welcome to what we've got. The kindness was so unexpected, so genuine, that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I blinked them back and took the form, filling it out with handwriting that looked shakier than I wanted it to. When I handed it back, Lillian studied the name I'd written. Wren Callahan, you're Nora's granddaughter. Again, not a question. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something quieter, more careful. I'm glad you came home. Nora talked about you every time she was in here. She never gave up hope. The tears I'd been holding back threatened to break through. Everyone keeps saying that. Lillian's expression shifted to something fierce. Because it's true. And because you should know that not everyone in this town works for Vidian. Some of us remember what it was like before they showed up and started buying everything. Some of us think your grandmother was right to fight them. She pulled a geological survey map from a drawer beneath the desk and spread it across the counter, pointing to a section in the foothills. See this? The spring on your property feeds into an aquifer that supplies water to 8 farms and half the wells in Ridgeview. If Vidian gets control of it, they can charge whatever they want for access, or cut people off entirely if they don't cooperate with the development plans. Her finger traced lines on the map that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant everything to her. Your grandmother understood that. She knew the land wasn't just about her family history. It was about protecting something essential for everyone who lives here. The weight of that knowledge settled over me like a physical thing. I hadn't just inherited a fight over property rights. I'd inherited responsibility for an entire community's water supply. Lillian rolled up the map and handed it to me. Take this, study it. Understand what you're protecting. And if you need help with research or documentation or anything else, you come back here. Vidian might have money and lawyers, but we've got records and history and people who remember. I left the library feeling like I'd found an ally I hadn't known existed, and the drive back to the property felt less isolating than it had that morning. The work on the Earth shelter began the next day. I spent the morning studying my grandmother's blueprints, trying to translate her careful drawings into actual physical labor. I had some hope of accomplishing. The plan called for excavating soil from the natural rise behind the Quonset hut and using it to cover the structure's roof and sides, transforming the visible metal shell into a grass-covered mound that would blend with the landscape. I was standing beside the excavation site with a shovel I'd found in the Quonset hut, trying to figure out where to even start, when I heard another vehicle approaching. This time my heart rate didn't spike with fear. I was getting used to the rhythm of rural life where neighbors appeared unannounced and visits were measured in practical help rather than social niceties. But the vehicle that pulled up wasn't a pickup truck. It was a black Mercedes sedan that looked obscenely out of place on the rutted dirt road, its paint job gleaming like oil in the morning sun. The man who emerged was probably in his mid-50s, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than every piece of clothing I'd ever owned combined. His hair was silver gray and perfectly styled, his shoes leather and polished to a mirror shine, and he moved with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. He smiled as he approached, the expression calculated and cold despite its superficial warmth. "You must be Ren Callahan. I'm Sterling Voss, Chief Acquisition Officer for Vidian Development." I didn't offer my hand, didn't smile back, just stood there with the shovel and waited for him to get to the point. His smile didn't waver. "I'm sure your lawyer mentioned our standing offer for this property. $175,000, well above market value. We're prepared to raise that to $200,000 if you're willing to close quickly." $200,000. More money than I could properly conceptualize. Enough to change everything about my life, to give me options and security and a future that didn't involve shoveling dirt and hiding from people who wanted me gone. My voice came out flat, emotionless. No. For just a moment, something flickered across Voss's expression. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. Then the smile returned, broader, and somehow more menacing. "I understand this is overwhelming. You're very young to be dealing with property ownership and tax obligations. Perhaps you haven't fully considered the challenges of maintaining land this remote. The winters here are brutal. The infrastructure is minimal. Remote properties carry risks, structural failures, equipment breakdowns, wildlife encounters. Your grandmother learned how dangerous isolation can be." The threat was unmistakable, despite the polite phrasing. I thought about my mother's car burning in a ravine, about my grandmother's fall that wasn't a fall, about Deputy-turned-Sheriff Kessler signing off on both deaths without asking difficult questions. I met Voss's eyes and kept my voice steady. "I'm not selling." His smile finally faded completely. "You're 18 years old with no family, no resources, and no understanding of what you're up against. Your grandmother was a stubborn old woman who let sentiment cloud her judgment, and it cost her everything. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake." The casual mention of my grandmother, the implicit confirmation that he knew exactly what had happened to her, made rage flare white-hot in my chest. But I'd learned in the group home that showing emotion to someone with power over you was a weakness they'd exploit. I kept my face blank, my body language neutral. Voss pulled a business card from his jacket and set it on the hood of the Ford. "When you change your mind, and you will, call this number. The offer stands for 30 days. After that, things get more complicated." He drove away in a cloud of dust and exhaust, leaving me standing in the meadow with my hands clenched around the shovel handle and my heart racing with an emotion that was equal parts terror and determination. That night I found the journal. It was wedged behind the footlocker, a small, leather-bound notebook that had probably cost 50 cents at a drugstore decades ago. The pages were filled with my grandmother's handwriting, stronger and steadier than in the letters, documenting years of offers and refusals and escalating pressure. One entry from 2 years ago made my blood run cold. Voss came again today. Said the setbacks that happened to the Torres family could happen to anyone who doesn't cooperate. I told him this land belongs to Ren, and I will never sell. He looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "Grandmothers don't live forever. If I die," he promised, "it will look like natural causes or an accident. No one will ask questions. The sheriff already knows to sign whatever paperwork Vivian needs." The final entry was dated 4 days before her death. They're running out of patience. I can feel it. If something happens to me, if I die suddenly or suspiciously, I pray Ren will understand it was not an accident. I pray she'll be brave enough to fight them when I no longer can. This land is worth fighting for, not for the money or the minerals, but for what it represents. A place that belongs to us, that we choose to protect, that no amount of corporate money can buy if we refuse to sell our souls along with the soil. I read that passage 3 times, my grandmother's words burning themselves into my memory. She'd known what was coming, had seen the pattern clearly enough to predict her own death. And still she'd fought, had refused to surrender, had left me everything she had, including the burden of continuing a battle she couldn't win. The despair that washed over me was total and absolute. I was 18 years old, with $73 left after paying the taxes. I had no family, no support system, no legal recourse against a company that had already committed at least 2 murders and gotten away with them. The smart thing, the only sane thing, was to call Voss's number, take the money, and run as fast and far as I could. I sat on the cot in the darkness with my grandmother's journal open on my lap and let myself cry. Not the quiet tears I'd shed reading her letters, but the kind of sobbing that came from somewhere deep and primal. The sound of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of what they could endure alone. The knock on the door came an hour later. I'd cried myself out and was sitting in numb silence, staring at nothing, when I heard boots on gravel and a firm rapping against metal. I opened the door to find Ivy standing there, and she wasn't alone. Behind her were 5 other people, all of them older than me, all of them looking at me with expressions that ranged from sympathetic to determined. Ivy's voice was gentle but firm. "Ren, these are your neighbors. We heard Voss paid you a visit today. Thought you might need some company." The man directly behind her stepped forward, extending a hand calloused from work. "Caleb Ford. I run a small carpentry business in town. Your grandmother helped my family when we were going through hard times. Figured I could return the favor." He was probably close to 30, with dark hair and work-roughened features and eyes that looked kind despite the wariness in them. He gestured to the others. "This is my crew. We're here to help with whatever you're building." One by one they introduced themselves. A woman in her 70s who'd known my grandmother for decades, a younger couple who farmed land adjacent to mine, Reverend Thomas Aldridge from the Baptist Church in Ridgeview, who looked more like a rancher than a preacher, and Lillian Hayes from the library, her presence somehow transforming from professional to personal in this new context. Ivy moved past me into the Quonset hut, the others following, and suddenly the space that had felt like a tomb became something else entirely. People were examining the blueprints, discussing load-bearing calculations, arguing cheerfully about the best approach to excavation and drainage. Caleb spread the plans across the workbench and studied them with a professional eye. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing. This is solid engineering. We can have the frame reinforced and the first layer of earth down within a month if we work steady." Lillian appeared at my elbow with a thermos of coffee I hadn't noticed her carrying. "We also took the liberty of starting a fund. Nothing huge, but enough to cover materials and maybe a legal consultation if you need one. Nora helped a lot of people over the years. This is us paying it forward. The generosity was so overwhelming, so unexpected, that I couldn't form words. These people didn't know me, had no reason to risk Vidian's displeasure by helping me. But they were here anyway, carrying tools and making plans and offering support I'd never thought to ask for. Because I'd never learned that support was something you could ask for. Ivy caught my eye across the room and smiled. You're not alone in this, girl. Your grandmother was family to half this town. That makes you family too. The words broke something open inside me, but this time what spilled out wasn't despair. It was something stranger and more fragile. Hope, the kind of hope that came from realizing that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face Sterling Voss and his threats and his blood money alone. Reverend Aldridge pulled out a phone that looked like it had survived multiple drops. I'm also putting you in touch with someone who might be able to help on the legal front. Friend of mine is an FBI agent stationed in Helena. She's been looking into Vidian's business practices for a while now. Corporate fraud, environmental violations, that kind of thing. If you've got evidence they're connected to your grandmother's death, she'll want to hear about it. My heart jumped. Evidence? He nodded. Anything. Documents, recordings, witness statements. The FBI's had trouble building a case because everyone who might testify ends up scared or bought off. But if you've got something solid... I thought about the journal, about the letters documenting threats, about the newspaper archives showing the same sheriff investigating 2 suspicious deaths 18 years apart. It wasn't proof in the legal sense, but it was a pattern. And patterns were sometimes enough to justify deeper investigation. Lillian pulled a folder from her bag. I also pulled the county property records for every parcel Vidian has acquired in the past 5 years. Thought you might want to see who sold and under what circumstances. There's a pattern of owners dying or experiencing catastrophic property damage in the months leading up to sale. Not proof, but definitely suspicious. The pieces were coming together, the scattered fragments of my grandmother's fight coalescing into something I could understand and potentially use. I wasn't just protecting land anymore. I was carrying forward a resistance that had been building for years, that involved more people than I'd realized, that mattered to a community I'd only just discovered existed. Caleb rolled up the blueprints and tucked them under his arm. We'll start tomorrow morning. Bring equipment and enough hands to make real progress. You focus on staying safe and documenting everything Voss does. Every threat, every contact, every attempt to intimidate you. Make a record. They left as the sun was setting, their vehicles kicking up dust that turned golden in the fading light. And I stood in the doorway of the Quonset hut, feeling like I'd just witnessed something miraculous. Community. That's what this was. The thing I'd read about in books and seen in movies, but never experienced firsthand. People showing up for each other, not because they had to, but because they'd chosen to. Because connection and loyalty meant more than self-preservation. The phone call came 3 days later. I'd bought a cheap cell phone in Ridgeview with the last of my money, and the number that appeared on the screen wasn't one I recognized. The woman's voice was professional, controlled. Is this Ren Callahan? My name is Special Agent Rebecca Holt with the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division. Reverend Aldridge gave me your contact information. I understand you may have information relevant to an ongoing investigation into Vidian Development's business practices. My pulse kicked up. This was real. The federal government was actually looking into the company that had threatened me, that had probably killed my grandmother, that had turned land acquisition into something that looked more like organized crime than real estate development. I found my voice. Yes, I have documents, a journal, letters, and I know the name of the sheriff who signed off on 2 suspicious deaths in my family. There was a pause on the other end, and when Agent Holt spoke again, I could hear the shift in her tone from routine inquiry to genuine interest. "I'd like to meet with you. Tomorrow, if possible. There's a diner in Ridgeview. Think it's called Maggie's. That should be neutral ground. 10 in the morning work for you?" I agreed and ended the call with hands that were shaking from adrenaline. This was the moment where my fight against Vidian development stopped being personal tragedy and started becoming something bigger. Evidence, investigation, the possibility of actual justice instead of just survival. That night I gathered everything I had: the journal, copies of the letters that mentioned threats, the newspaper archives Lillian had helped me find, the property records showing the pattern of suspicious deaths and sales. I put it all in a folder and tried not to think about what would happen if Voss found out I was talking to the FBI. The vandalism started the next morning. I woke to find the Ford's tires slashed, all 4 of them sitting on bare rims. The water from the well pump had a chemical smell that burned my throat when I tried to drink it. And nailed to the Quonset hut door was a note written in block letters: "Last warning. Sell or suffer the consequences." I stared at the note for a long moment, my heart racing, and felt rage burn away the fear. This was what my grandmother had faced. This was how they operated, not with honest competition or fair negotiation, but with intimidation and sabotage and violence, thinly veiled as accidents. I called Ivy. She arrived within 20 minutes with Caleb and 2 others, and they photographed everything: the tires, the note, the contaminated well. Evidence for Agent Holt, proof that Vidian's threats weren't hypothetical. Caleb examined the well with a testing kit he'd brought. "This is chlorine bleach. Large quantity dumped directly into your water supply. Could have made you seriously sick if you'd drunk enough." Ivy's expression was grim. "They're escalating. That means they're getting desperate. But it also means they're getting sloppy. Keep documenting everything. Every threat gives the FBI more ammunition." The meeting with Agent Holt was everything I'd hoped for and more. She listened to my story without interruption, took careful notes, examined the documents I'd brought with an attention to detail that suggested she already had pieces of this puzzle, and I just handed her several more. When I finished, she leaned back in the diner booth and fixed me with a look that was equal parts concern and determination. "Ren, I need you to understand something. What you're describing is serious, if even half of what you suspect is true. Vidian Development isn't just a predatory real estate company. They're engaged in systematic intimidation, possibly conspiracy to commit murder, and definite violations of federal environmental and corporate regulations." She tapped the folder of documents. "But building a case that will stick requires more than suspicious patterns. I need concrete evidence, recorded threats, financial records linking Vidian to the sheriff or other officials, witness testimony from people willing to go on record." My stomach sank. "I don't have that. Just my grandmother's journal and some newspaper articles." Agent Holt's expression softened slightly. "What you have is enough to justify continuing our investigation, and it's enough to put you on our radar as a potential witness if we can build a prosecutable case. But I need you to be careful, very careful. If Vidian suspects you're cooperating with federal authorities, they'll either accelerate their intimidation tactics or try to buy you off before you can testify." She slid a card across the table. "This is my direct number. You call me immediately if anything happens. Any threats, any property damage, any contact from Voss or his representatives. And in the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every incident, every piece of evidence you find. Assume you're building a legal case, because that's exactly what we're doing." I left the diner with a card in my pocket and a strange mixture of hope and terror churning in my gut. The FBI was investigating. Agent Holt believed me. But I was also now officially in the middle of something that could end with federal indictments, or could end with me sharing my grandmother's fate, depending on who moved faster. Justice or Sterling Voss. The work on the Earth shelter continued, despite the threats. Caleb and his crew showed up every morning with tools and machinery, and slowly the Quonset hut began its transformation. Soil from the rise behind the structure got excavated and piled, then carefully spread across the roof and sides. Drainage systems went in. Reinforcement beams got installed. The visible metal shell started disappearing beneath layers of earth that would eventually support grass and wildflowers. I worked alongside them, learning skills I'd never imagined needing. How to operate a small excavator, how to mix and apply waterproofing compounds, how to calculate load distribution so the roof wouldn't collapse under the weight of 2 feet of soil. Caleb was patient, explaining things multiple times if necessary, treating me like an apprentice rather than a burden. One afternoon, while we were taking a water break, he gestured at the partially buried structure. "You know what your grandmother was building here? Not just a house, a statement. Something that says you can't be moved, can't be intimidated, can't be erased." I looked at the earth-covered walls, at the grass already starting to take root in the soil we'd seeded, and understood what he meant. In another 6 months, this place would look like a natural hill, invisible from a distance, impossible to distinguish from the landscape. My grandmother had designed a home that would disappear into the land itself, that would become so integral to the terrain that removing it would mean destroying the ground it sat on. It was beautiful, defiant, absolutely perfect. The second threat came 3 weeks later. I found it spray painted across the side of the Quonset hut in red letters 2 feet high. "Leave now, or die like your grandmother." This time I didn't call Ivy first. I called Agent Holt, and she arrived within 4 hours with a photographer and an evidence collection team. They documented everything, took paint samples, dusted for fingerprints that probably wouldn't be there. Holt stood with me looking at the message. "This is good for our case. Bad for your safety, but good for prosecution. Explicit threat referencing your grandmother's death. That's admission of prior knowledge at minimum." She turned to face me fully. "Ren, I need to ask you something. Are you willing to wear a wire? If Voss or anyone from Vidian contacts you again, we could get them on tape making threats or offering bribes. That would be the kind of concrete evidence we need." The idea terrified me, but I thought about my grandmother facing down these same threats alone for years, about the other families who'd been driven off their land, about the community that had rallied around me despite the risks. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Yes, I'll do it." The wire came 2 days later, a small device that clipped to my clothing and recorded everything within a 20-foot radius. Agent Holt walked me through how to use it, how to guide conversations toward admissible statements, how to stay safe while gathering evidence. And then we waited for Voss to contact me again, for the intimidation to escalate, for the moment when Sterling Voss would make a mistake large enough that the FBI could move from investigation to prosecution. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Voss's voice was smooth as oil through the phone line. "Miss Callahan, I notice you're still living on the property, still refusing our very generous offer. I'm disappointed." I activated the recording device with shaking hands. "I'm not selling, Mr. Voss. This land belongs to my family." His laugh was cold. "Your family is dead, Ren. Your mother died 18 years ago in an unfortunate accident. Your grandmother died 3 months ago in another tragic accident. These things happen to stubborn people who don't understand when to cut their losses. The admission was so blatant it took my breath away. Are you threatening me? Another laugh, but this one had an edge. I'm stating facts. You're very young to be living alone in such a remote location. Property failures happen all the time. Structural collapses, well contamination, equipment malfunctions. And sometimes, when the county finally auctions off abandoned property, Vidian Development is there to acquire it at very reasonable prices. My hand clenched around the phone. You killed them. You killed my mother and my grandmother because they wouldn't sell. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then his voice came back, colder than before. I'm a businessman, Miss Callahan. I don't kill people. I simply create situations where people make rational choices. Your grandmother chose not to sell. She chose to stay on dangerous property despite warnings. What happened after that was unfortunate, but entirely her own fault. He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. You have 24 hours to accept our offer. After that, I can't guarantee your safety. Terrible things happen in these mountains. Bears, fires. So many ways a young woman living alone could suffer a fatal accident. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of the Quonset hut with the recording device still running and felt the full weight of what I'd just done. I had Sterling Voss on tape essentially confessing to creating the circumstances of my grandmother's death, threatening me with the same fate. It wasn't a full admission of murder, but it was close enough that Agent Holt could probably use it. I called her immediately. She listened to the recording 3 times, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. This is it, Ren. This is what we needed. I'm going to need you to stay somewhere safe for the next 48 hours while we move on this. Can you do that? Ivy's house became my refuge. She insisted I bring everything important, the letters, the journal, the title deed, and helped me pack them into waterproof containers we buried in her root cellar. Just in case Voss made good on his threats and burned the Quonset hut while I was gone. The next 2 days felt like existing in suspended animation. I stayed inside, helped Ivy with farm chores that kept my hands busy, if not my mind, and waited for word from Agent Holt. It came on the second evening. Her voice on the phone was professional, but I could hear the triumph underneath. We've made arrests. Sterling Voss, Sheriff Martin Kessler, and 3 Vidian Development executives. Charges include conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, environmental crimes, and about a dozen other violations. Your recording was the final piece we needed. The relief that washed over me was so complete I had to sit down. What happens now? Agent Holt's tone shifted to something more cautious. Now comes the hard part. Building the full case, getting testimony, making sure the charges stick. Voss has expensive lawyers. But we've got evidence, we've got patterns, and we've got you willing to testify. That's more than we've had in the 18 months I've been investigating them. I thought about my grandmother, about all those letters she'd written telling me I wasn't alone. About the journal where she documented every threat, every pressure tactic, every moment of fear. She'd been building this case without knowing it, creating a record that would outlive her and bring down the people who'd killed her. She'd won. We'd won. When I drove back to the property the next morning, Caleb and his crew were already there, putting finishing touches on the earth shelter. The Quonset hut had disappeared completely beneath gentle slopes of soil, now thick with growing grass. From a distance, it looked like a natural hill, just another feature of the landscape. Only the door, set into what appeared to be a hillside, gave any indication that something human-made existed there. Caleb grinned when he saw my expression. Welcome home, Ren. Your fortress is complete. I stood looking at what we'd built. What my grandmother had designed and my community had helped create, and felt something settle in my chest. This was home. Not because of the structure or the land itself, but because I'd chosen it. Because people had chosen to help me protect it. Because it represented something worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. That evening, I sat on the grass-covered roof of my earth shelter and watched the sun set over the Cascade foothills. 5 acres of land that had cost my grandmother and my mother their lives. 5 acres that had nearly cost me mine. But also 5 acres that had taught me what family really meant, what community could accomplish, what happened when people refused to be intimidated by money and power and threats. I pulled out my grandmother's final letter, the one that had simply said, "Welcome home, Wren. Fight for it. This is yours," and felt tears slide down my face. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude. She'd left me more than land. She'd left me a legacy of resistance, a community of allies, and proof that sometimes the stubborn refusal to surrender was its own kind of victory. The fight wasn't over. There would be trials, testimony, probably more threats from Vidian's lawyers trying to discredit me or Agent Holt's evidence. But for tonight, I had this. A home that couldn't be seen, land that couldn't be taken, and the knowledge that my grandmother's love had reached across death to bring me home and teach me how to stand my ground. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. And that made all the difference. The morning after Agent Holt called with news of the arrests, I woke to find Caleb's truck already parked outside the earth shelter. He was leaning against the hood with 2 cups of coffee from the diner in Ridgeview, steam rising into the cold November air. He handed me one without preamble. "Thought you should know before you hear it somewhere else. Voss made bail. Him and Kessler both. Judge set it at $500,000 each, and Vidian's corporate account paid it within 2 hours." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. I'd spent the night imagining Sterling Voss in a cell, Sheriff Kessler stripped of his badge and authority, both of them facing the weight of federal charges without the protection of money or position. The reality was uglier. Rich men didn't stay in jail while they waited for trial. They posted bail and walked free and hired lawyers expensive enough to tie up cases for years. Caleb's expression was grim. "Agent Holt called me this morning. Wanted me to pass along a warning. Voss's lawyers are claiming the recording was obtained illegally, that you entrapped him, that the FBI overstepped in making the arrests. They're filing motions to suppress evidence and get the charges dismissed." My hands tightened around the coffee cup hard enough that the cardboard buckled. "Can they do that?" He shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. "They can try. Whether they'll succeed depends on how good their lawyers are versus how solid the FBI's case is." Holt says she's confident, but trials take time. Could be months before this gets resolved. Months. I've been thinking in terms of days or weeks, imagining a swift resolution where justice prevailed and I could finally stop looking over my shoulder. The prospect of living under this threat for months, of watching Voss walk around free while lawyers argued about technicalities and admissibility, made exhaustion settle into my bones. Caleb must have read something in my expression, because his voice gentled. "You're not doing this alone, Wren. Whatever happens, however long it takes, we're here." The "we" he referred to had grown in the weeks since the earth shelter's completion. Ivy still came by 3 times a week with food and practical advice. Lillian had started bringing books she thought I'd like, staying for hours to talk about everything and nothing. Reverend Aldridge checked in regularly, his presence less about faith and more about making sure I knew I had allies. Even the crew Caleb had brought for construction had become familiar faces, people who waved when they passed on the road or stopped to share news from town. But the arrest and bail situation had shifted something fundamental. The people who'd been casually supportive were now actively protective, as if Voss making bail had transformed this from an interesting local conflict into something that required circling the wagons. That protection manifested in unexpected ways. I'd wake to find fresh tire tracks around the perimeter of the property, Caleb or one of his crew driving past at odd hours to check on things. Ivy installed motion sensor lights along my access road without asking permission. Lillian created a phone tree where any unusual activity near my land would trigger calls to half a dozen people within minutes. The community was preparing for something. I just didn't know what yet. The first sign came 3 days after Voss posted bail. I'd driven into Ridgeview to buy supplies, and when I returned, the gate at the entrance to my property was open. Not broken. Open. As if someone had simply unlocked it and walked through. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The earth shelter looked exactly as I'd left it, the grass-covered mound blending seamlessly with the landscape. The Ford sat where I'd parked it that morning. But there was a wrongness to the air, a sense that someone had been here, had walked through my space, had touched things they had no right to touch. I found the evidence inside. My grandmother's journal, the one I'd been keeping in a locked drawer, was sitting on the workbench, open to the page where she'd written about Voss's threats. The letters from the tin box were scattered across the floor. Not violently, but deliberately, arranged in a pattern that felt like a message even if I couldn't decode what it meant. And on the wall above the wood stove, someone had used a black marker to write a single sentence. Evidence burns. My first call was to Agent Holt. My second was to Caleb. Both arrived within the hour, Caleb bringing 4 others with him, all of them armed with cameras and grim determination. Holt photographed everything, her movements precise and professional, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. This is witness intimidation, breaking and entering, conspiracy, but it's also a warning about what comes next. She turned to face me fully. Ren, I need you to understand something. Voss's lawyers are good, and they're arguing that you provoked him into making threats, that the recording is inadmissible. If that evidence gets thrown out, our case gets significantly weaker. We'd still have the pattern of suspicious deaths and property acquisitions. But proving direct involvement becomes harder. Caleb was examining the lock on the door, his expression dark. No forced entry. Whoever did this had a key or knows how to pick locks well enough not to leave marks. The implication hung in the air. Someone with skills, someone organized, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Not random vandalism, calculated intimidation. Ivy arrived while we were still documenting everything, took one look at the scene, and made a decision. You're not staying here alone tonight. Pack a bag. You're coming to my place until we figure out what Voss is planning. I wanted to argue, to insist that running would be giving in, that my grandmother had faced down threats alone for years. But the scattered letters on the floor, 18 years of her trying to reach me, now violated by someone who'd walked uninvited into the home she'd built, made rage and fear war in my chest until I couldn't tell which emotion was winning. Lillian bent to gather the letters, handling them with the reverence of someone who understood what they represented. We should make copies. Multiple copies, digital backups. If they're threatening to burn evidence, we need to make sure that evidence exists in places they can't reach. The next 2 hours turned into an impromptu evidence preservation party. Lillian had brought a portable scanner from the library. We spread out in Ivy's kitchen and methodically copied every page of my grandmother's journal, every letter, every document related to the property. The files went onto 3 separate USB drives, into cloud storage Lillian set up for me, and into a safe deposit box at the bank in Ridgeview that required 2 keys to open. Agent Holt watched the process with approval. "This is smart. Good practice even without the threats. But I want you all to understand that we're past the point of amateur investigation here. Vidian has shown they're willing to escalate. The next step could be violence." Reverend Aldridge, who'd appeared sometime during the copying process with sandwiches and thermoses of soup, met Holt's eyes with surprising steel. "Then we escalate our protection. Wren doesn't go anywhere alone. Someone's with her 24/7 until this trial happens, and Voss is behind bars permanently." The matter-of-fact way he said it, as if organizing round-the-clock security for someone he barely knew was a normal Tuesday activity, made my throat tight. These people had no obligation to me, had every reason to stay out of a fight with a corporation that had already killed at least 2 people. But they were choosing to stand beside me anyway, transforming what had been a lonely inheritance into something that felt like family. The watch rotation started that night. Caleb took first shift, parking his truck outside Ivy's house with a clear view of both entrances. When I protested that this was too much, that I couldn't ask people to lose sleep protecting me, he just shrugged. "You're not asking. We're offering. There's a difference." I spent the week at Ivy's place, helping with farm chores during the day, and trying not to think too hard about what it meant that I needed armed protection to live on my own land. Ivy never complained about the invasion, never suggested I was being dramatic or paranoid. She just made up the guest room, taught me how to can vegetables from her garden, and treated the whole situation like a temporary inconvenience rather than a life-altering crisis. On the 5th night, Lillian brought news from town. Voss's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss all charges. They're claiming the FBI's investigation was based on hearsay and circumstantial evidence, that the recording was obtained through entrapment, and that their client is being prosecuted for aggressive but legal business practices. Agent Holt had warned me this was coming, but hearing it stated so baldly made the ground feel unstable beneath my feet. "What does that mean for the case?" Lillian's expression was troubled. "There's a hearing scheduled for next month. Judge will decide whether the evidence is admissible and whether there's enough to proceed to trial. If the recording gets thrown out and the judge decides the rest is too circumstantial." She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. I'd watched enough legal dramas during slow nights at the group home to understand what happened when evidence got suppressed. Cases fell apart. Charges got dismissed. People who'd committed terrible crimes walked free because the system prioritized procedure over justice. The rage that had been simmering since I'd found my grandmother's letters violated finally boiled over. So he might just get away with it. With killing my mother and my grandmother and probably others. Because his lawyers can argue about whether I entrapped him by answering my phone when he called to threaten me. Ivy's hand found my shoulder, steady and warm. Maybe, or maybe the judge sees through their legal maneuvering and lets the case proceed. We don't know yet. What we do know is that we've got a month to gather any other evidence we can find, any other witnesses willing to go on record, anything that strengthens the FBI's case. Reverend Aldridge leaned forward from where he'd been sitting quietly at Ivy's kitchen table. "I've been making calls. There are 3 other families in the county who sold to Vidian after experiencing property damage or threats. None of them were willing to talk before because they were scared. But now that arrests have been made, now that it's clear there's an actual investigation, 2 of them are reconsidering." Hope flickered to life in my chest. "Would they testify?" He nodded slowly. "If they believe their testimony will matter, if they think Voss will actually face consequences. But if this case gets dismissed, if he walks free, they'll disappear back into silence, and we'll never get them to speak up again. This moment, Right now is our window. The strategy session that followed involved more people than Ivy's kitchen was designed to hold. Caleb brought contact information for contractors who'd worked on Vidian projects and been stiffed on payment. Lillian had dug up property records showing shell companies Vidian used to hide the extent of their acquisitions. Agent Holt arrived with a list of specific documentation she needed to strengthen the federal case. We divided up tasks like we were planning a campaign, rather than just gathering evidence. Which, I realized as I watched this group of people who barely knew each other coordinate with military precision, was exactly what we were doing. Campaigning against a corporation with infinite resources and no conscience, using the only weapons we had. Persistence, documentation, and the kind of stubborn refusal to be intimidated that my grandmother had modeled until the day they killed her for it. The work consumed the next 3 weeks. I spent my days tracking down former Vidian employees willing to talk about pressure tactics they'd witnessed. Lillian combed through public records looking for financial irregularities. Caleb interviewed contractors who'd seen things on Vidian job sites that didn't match the official permits or environmental assessments. Slowly, piece by piece, we built a case file that looked less like circumstantial evidence and more like a pattern of criminal enterprise spanning years. Bribery, fraud, environmental violations, intimidation. And woven through all of it, the deaths that had been ruled accidental, but that formed a constellation of convenient timing for Vidian's expansion plans. Agent Holt reviewed our findings with an expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise. This is good work, better than good. Some of this, the contractor testimony, the financial records, this is material we didn't have before. It strengthens our case significantly, but her next words carried a warning that made my stomach clench. It also makes you a bigger target. If Vidian realizes you're actively building evidence against them, they'll move to shut you down before the hearing. The legal route if they can, but... She didn't finish the sentence. The but hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Caleb's response was immediate. Then we tighten security. No one goes anywhere alone. We document every movement, every interaction, make it impossible for them to act without witnesses. The protection detail intensified. I couldn't walk to the mailbox without someone materializing from a truck parked at the property line. Couldn't drive into town without Caleb or one of his crew following at a discreet distance. The constant surveillance should have felt suffocating, but instead it felt like being wrapped in a safety net I hadn't known I needed. The fire came on a Thursday night, 3 days before the hearing. I'd finally returned to the Earth shelter that afternoon, needing to be in my own space even if that space came with guards posted at intervals around the perimeter. Ivy had tried to convince me to stay at her place one more night, but I'd been firm. I wouldn't let Voss's threats keep me from my grandmother's land, from the home we'd built, from the legacy I was fighting to protect. Caleb was on watch duty, his truck parked where he could see both the access road and the front of the Earth shelter. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from weeks of late nights gathering evidence and preparing for the hearing. The smell of smoke woke me first. Not wood smoke from a fireplace, but the acrid chemical stink of accelerant catching fire, of something burning that wasn't meant to burn. I bolted upright in the darkness, my heart already racing, and saw orange light flickering through the small windows set high in the Earth shelter's walls. For a disorienting moment, my sleep-fogged brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then understanding crashed over me with the force of physical blow. Fire. The Earth shelter was on fire. I grabbed my phone and keys, shoved my feet into boots without bothering to lace them, and ran for the door. The heat hit me the moment I opened it. A wall of scorching air that made my eyes water and my lungs seize. Flames were climbing the wooden support beams I could see through the doorway, fed by something that made them burn blue and yellow and far too hot for natural fuel. This wasn't an accident. This was arson. Deliberate and calculated and meant to destroy everything I'd built, everything my grandmother had left me, all the evidence we'd gathered that proved Vididian's pattern of destruction. Caleb was already running toward me, phone pressed to his ear, shouting into it. "Fire at the Whitmore property! We need trucks, now!" But we both knew the volunteer fire department was 20 minutes away in good conditions, and these weren't good conditions. The flames were spreading too fast, consuming the wooden interior framing with a voraciousness that spoke of professional accelerant application. I stood frozen for a moment, watching my home burn, and felt something inside me break. Not despair. Something harder and sharper. The absolute certainty that Voss had done this, that he decided burning me out was easier than fighting the legal battle, that he believed destroying the physical evidence would somehow make the case against him disappear. Caleb grabbed my arm. "Is there anything irreplaceable inside? Anything you absolutely need?" The question snapped me into motion. The letters, the journal, the original documents. I'd made copies, yes, but the originals were in there, along with the tin box that had held them, along with every physical piece of my grandmother's legacy. Before Caleb could stop me, I was running back toward the burning structure. The heat was intense, but the earth covering the shelter had created a barrier that slowed the flames' spread. I could see a path, narrow and dangerous but possibly navigable, to the workbench where I'd left the tin box. Caleb's voice behind me was raw with fear. "Ren, no! It's not worth your life!" But I was already inside. My jacket pulled up over my mouth and nose, my eyes squinted nearly shut against the smoke. The tin box sat exactly where I'd left it, the metal already hot to the touch. I grabbed it and turned to run back out. That's when I heard the crack. A support beam giving way under the combination of fire and the weight of earth above. The sound was enormous. A gunshot multiplied, and I had just enough time to throw myself forward before the section of roof behind me collapsed inward. Caleb caught me as I stumbled out, the tin box clutched against my chest. We ran 20 yards before turning to watch the earth shelter's interior cave in on itself. The carefully constructed engineering my grandmother had designed and my community had built, folding like paper under the assault of fire and failing structure. By the time the fire trucks arrived, there was nothing left to save. The grass-covered mound that had been my home looked like a volcano. Smoke pouring from the collapsed center, the doorframe a rectangle of flame and char. The fire chief, a man named Dalton who'd been friendly during the times I'd seen him at the diner, approached with an expression mixing professional assessment and personal anger. "Accelerant. I can smell it from here. This was deliberate arson, no question. We'll need to investigate once it cools. But I'd bet money we find evidence of gasoline or something similar." Agent Holt arrived while the firefighters were still pouring water onto the smoldering ruins. She took one look at the scene, then turned to me with eyes that burned with an intensity that matched the dying flames. "Tell me everything. Every detail from when you went to bed until now." The story came out in fragments. The smell that woke me, the orange light, the realization that someone had set fire to my home while I was sleeping inside it. The sprint to save the letters because they represented the only physical connection I had to a grandmother I'd never met. Holt's expression grew harder with each detail. "This is attempted murder. Arson with intent to harm. The fact that you were inside when they said it means we can add that to the charges against Voss." Caleb, who'd been examining the perimeter of the property with a flashlight, called out, "Found something!" We followed him to a section of fence line 50 yards from the earth shelter. Tire tracks in soft mud, fresh enough that water was still seeping into the impressions. Boot prints leading from where a vehicle had parked to a point near the earth shelter's ventilation system. And, discarded in the grass, an empty gasoline can. Agent Holt photographed everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case, but her hands were shaking slightly. Sloppy. They got sloppy. This is evidence we can use. Lillian's car came speeding up the access road, followed closely by Ivy's truck and Reverend Aldridge's sedan. Within minutes, half of Ridgeview seemed to be materializing from the darkness, people I barely knew arriving with thermoses of coffee and blankets and expressions of rage that matched my own. Ivy wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and her voice was steady despite the fury I could see in her eyes. "You're coming back to my place. All of you. We'll figure out next steps in the morning when we can think clearly." But Lillian was already on her phone, and when she lowered it, her expression carried a fierce satisfaction. "I just called the regional news station. They're sending a crew." By morning, everyone in Montana will know that Vidian Development burned down the home of a teenage girl who was actively cooperating with a federal investigation into their business practices. The statement was strategic and brilliant and absolutely calculated to turn this from a local property dispute into a public relations nightmare for Vidian. If Voss had hoped the fire would intimidate me into silence, he'd miscalculated badly. The news crew arrived at dawn, their satellite truck looking absurdly out of place on the rural road. The reporter, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and professional skepticism, interviewed Agent Holt first, then me, then several of the community members who'd shown up to help. By midday, the story was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national outlets looking for content that fit the narrative of corporate malfeasance and individual courage. Teen orphan survives arson attack while fighting development company. Made for compelling television, and the footage of the still smoldering earth shelter provided visual drama that kept the story cycling through news programs for days. The public attention changed everything. Vidian's lawyers, who'd been confidently arguing for dismissal of charges, suddenly found themselves defending a client accused of attempted murder in service of a land grab. The two families Reverend Aldridge had been courting as potential witnesses came forward publicly, no longer afraid to speak now that cameras and reporters were watching. 3 former Vidian employees contacted Agent Holt with testimony about illegal orders they'd witnessed and refused to follow. The case that had been built on careful documentation and pattern recognition transformed into something with the weight of public outrage behind it. Vidian's stock price dropped. Their CEO gave a press conference distancing the company from Voss's actions. The governor's office announced a review of all Vidian's development permits across the state. And through it all, I lived in Ivy's guest room and watched my home's ruins cool to ash, and tried to process the fact that someone had tried to kill me. The preliminary hearing happened 5 days after the fire. Voss's lawyers had filed for a continuance, but the judge, perhaps influenced by the media coverage, perhaps simply by the severity of the new charges, denied the request. Agent Holt had prepared me for what to expect, but walking into that courtroom and seeing Sterling Voss sitting at the defense table, perfectly groomed and coldly confident despite the attempted murder charge, made my hands shake with suppressed rage. The prosecutor was a federal attorney named Williams, who'd flown in from Helena specifically for this case. His opening statement was devastating in its precision. A point-by-point destruction of Vidian's claims that this was about aggressive but legal business practices, backed by testimony from victims, documentation of threats, financial records showing payoffs to Sheriff Kessler, and the physical evidence from the arson. Voss's lead attorney, an expensive suit from Seattle with a reputation for getting white-collar criminals reduced sentences, tried to argue that his client was being railroaded by publicity, that the arson was committed by unknown parties trying to frame Vidian, that the recording of threats was taken out of context. The judge listened to both sides with an expression that gave nothing away. When the arguments concluded, she took exactly 10 minutes to review her notes before delivering her ruling. Her voice was crisp, brooking no argument. Having reviewed the evidence presented, This court finds sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial on all charges. The defendant's motion to dismiss is denied. Additionally, given the severity of the arson charge and the clear pattern of intimidation documented by the prosecution, I'm revoking bail. Mr. Voss will remain in federal custody pending trial. The bang of her gavel echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Voss's expression finally cracked, shock and fury replacing the cold confidence. His lawyers immediately began arguing, but the judge was already standing, already leaving, and the federal marshals were already moving to take Voss into custody. I watched them handcuff him. Sterling Voss, the man who'd killed my mother and grandmother, who'd tried to kill me, who'd terrorized a community for years in service of corporate profit, and felt something inside me finally release. Not victory yet. The trial would still happen, could still theoretically go wrong. But this moment, seeing him led away in restraints while cameras captured every second, felt like the beginning of justice finally catching up to power. Outside the courthouse, Agent Holt pulled me aside. This is just the start. Trial won't happen for months, maybe a year. But Voss in custody means Vidian can't use him to orchestrate more intimidation. And the publicity means they're going to be scrambling to distance themselves from his actions, which makes them less likely to retaliate. Caleb, who'd sat through the entire hearing with quiet intensity, met my eyes with something like relief. You did it. Your grandmother spent years fighting them and got killed for it. You finished what she started. But standing there, surrounded by people who'd risked their own safety to help me, I knew it wasn't just me who'd finished anything. It was all of us. The community that had rallied when a stranger showed up claiming family connection to a dead woman. The librarian who'd helped research property records. The carpenter who'd built an earth shelter and then stood guard over it. The neighbor who'd taken in a homeless orphan and treated her like the granddaughter she'd never met. Lillian appeared with a folder. I've been working on something. With the insurance company, Nora had a policy on the Quonset hut and its contents. It won't cover everything, but it's enough to rebuild. If you want to. The question hung in the air between us. Did I want to rebuild? To stay on land that had cost so much blood and pain? To continue fighting for 5 acres in the middle of Montana when I could take the insurance money and Vidian's standing offer and disappear into a life that was easier, safer, less complicated? I looked at the faces around me, at Ivy with her weathered hands and unwavering loyalty, at Caleb, whose carpentry skills had helped hide my home from Voss's sight, at Lillian, who'd weaponized public records in service of justice, at Reverend Aldridge, who'd organized a protection detail like he was running a military campaign. My voice came out steady, certain. I want to rebuild. Better this time. Stronger. I want to make this land into exactly what my grandmother envisioned. A home that can't be moved or intimidated or destroyed. Ivy's smile was fierce with approval. Then we'll help you do it. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding and preparation. The insurance payout, combined with donations from community members, gave me resources I'd never imagined having. Caleb designed the new earth shelter with fireproofing and structural improvements. The work went faster this time. We knew what we were doing, had learned from mistakes, had a template to follow. By the time the trial date was set for the following spring, the new shelter was complete. Better engineered, more hidden. A statement that violence couldn't erase determination. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the letters, the journal, the recording of Voss's threats, the fire that had nearly killed me. Voss's lawyers tried to paint me as an opportunist exploiting tragedy. The prosecutor demolished that narrative with testimony from Agent Holt, with financial records, with the physical evidence of arson and attempted murder. Sheriff Kessler had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Voss. His testimony about being paid to rule deaths accidental, about falsifying reports, about actively helping Vidian intimidate property owners, was delivered in a monotone that suggested he'd already checked out of his own life. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict in a voice that shook slightly. Guilty on all counts. Voss showed no emotion, just sat there and accepted that money hadn't been enough to buy his way out. The judge sentenced him 3 weeks later. Life in federal prison without possibility of parole. I attended the sentencing, but didn't speak. My grandmother's letters spoke for her. The charred remains of the earth shelter spoke for themselves. The jury's verdict spoke loudly enough. 5 years passed in a way that felt both slow and shockingly fast. The earth shelter became a real home. The gardens produced more than I could eat. Solar panels and a wind turbine made the property completely off-grid. The spring became a resource I shared freely with neighboring farms. Ivy and I fell into a rhythm where we were more than neighbors. Family. The kind you choose. Caleb's carpentry business grew. He built a small workshop on my property. We never defined what we were beyond friends who kissed sometimes, but the ambiguity didn't bother me. Lillian left the library to work for a non-profit investigating corporate land grabs. Watching her transform from librarian to fierce advocate was one of the unexpected joys. The land healed. Wildlife returned. The grass covering the earth shelter grew so thick that sometimes I'd have to pause to locate the door. On my 23rd birthday, I framed 12 of my grandmother's letters, one from each year she'd written. They went up on the wall, a gallery of love that had crossed time and distance. The money from Vidian's seized accounts got distributed to victims. I put most of mine into a trust funding scholarships for kids aging out of foster care. The earth shelter became a pilgrimage site for people fighting corporations. I'd show them around, let them see that resistance was possible. One afternoon in late summer, I sat on the grass-covered roof watching the sun paint the Cascade foothills in amber and gold. The tin box rested beside me. I thought about my grandmother maintaining hope through silence, about how she designed a home that would disappear into the land, that would protect through invisibility. The land stretched out around me, 5 acres that had been worth dying for and worth living for, not because of minerals or water rights, but because it represented something essential, the right to choose where you belong. My grandmother had kept this place through years when she had no guarantee I'd ever know it existed, had protected it with stubborn refusal even when that refusal cost everything. I pulled out my phone and called the Northview group home. When the director answered, I explained who I was and what I wanted to do. The scholarship fund was operational, but I wanted to offer more. A place kids could go when they aged out. Not forever, but long enough to find their footing. The earth shelter had room. The land had space for people to breathe and heal. I had 5 acres of proof that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money, but the example of someone who refused to give up. The director's voice was cautious but interested. "That's generous, Ms. Callahan. We'd need to discuss specifics." But she didn't say no. As the sun dipped below the mountain ridge, I gathered the tin box and climbed down. Inside, the earth shelter was warm and solid. The letters on the wall caught lamplight. I'd stopped being the orphan the system produced, had become the heir to a legacy of resistance, the keeper of land that represented more than property lines, the beneficiary of love that transcended death. The door to my home closed with a solid click, not the bureaucratic finality of Northview's door, but the satisfied sound of something fitting perfectly. "Welcome home," my grandmother had written. "Fight for it. This is yours." I'd fought. I'd won. And in winning, I'd discovered that home wasn't something given by caseworkers or inherited through documents. It was something you built, defended, and shared with people who chose to stand beside you. The land was mine, but more than that, I was the land's, rooted and growing and absolutely, finally, home.